All right, good morning, everybody. And as Jesse mentioned, I'm going to be reading Matthew chapter 2. And this is a continuation of the birth of Jesus, continuation of that story we started in Matthew 1. And as I go through this, I'm going to make some comments about it. We're going to see that it's the Gentiles that are making the effort to find Jesus. It's not the Jews. And remember, he came for the Jews. So he came for all of us, but they weren't interested. So we're going to see Gentiles being the ones that are searching him out and trying to find him. The Jews knew he was coming. In fact, the Old Testament scriptures told them that. I think I have a couple slides to show you. This is Isaiah 7:14. This told them he was coming. Therefore the Lord himself shall give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. Also Isaiah in 9:6 says, For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. There's other passages, of course. Micah 5:2, which I'll show you in a little bit, is another one. And then, of course, Isaiah 53 talks about him too. So as I go through these verses, let's look at verse 1. It says, Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem. Well, who's Herod the king? There was a lot of Herods, and I have a chart. We've seen this before when I read through Acts, and I'm using the same chart again. You can see him up at the top in the gray. That's Herod the Great. And let me find this. There he is right there, Herod the Great. And then he had all these wives across the top in the white boxes, and then, of course, sons and daughters and so forth below that. So there's Herod the Great. There's other Herods in our scriptures. Herod Philip, Aristobalus, Herod Antipas, and then Philip II is another Herod. These guys, of course, down below, some more Herods. You can see them on the chart. So we got to make sure we're talking about the right guy, and this one is Herod the Great. He was the king in Judea, and he had the help of Rome to get this appointment to be the Herod, or be over them. He was appointed in 40 BC, and he died in around 4 AD. So that's 40 plus 4, that's 44 years that he was the king there. He built the temple. This is the temple that Christ actually saw and spoke in, of course. He built a lot of beautiful buildings in Jerusalem and other cities, and so he was quite famous, so to speak. But I'm going to tell you a little bit more about him in a few minutes to give us some more background on the fellow. But the Magi, which are also mentioned in verse 1, these are wise men from the east, as it says there in verse 1. And they were probably experts in the study of stars. We've got a big star coming up that's important to our story. And they were following that star because they had heard of the birth of the child, which is, he's known as the King of the Jews. Since they heard that, they wanted to go visit him, and they're following this star to do this. We know from not just hymns and songs and pictures, including a picture like this, shows us 3 Magi. There were probably more than 3, but all of our secular and even biblical portrayals of this is 3 of them. The reason is probably there were those 3 gifts that they brought. The frankincense, the myrrh, and what's the third one? Gold. That's the most important one. So with the 3 gifts, everybody associates it with just 3 wise men. There was probably more. Okay, so this star that they're following is a supernatural phenomenon. It's not Halley's Comet. It's not just a star like some famous star that you might know of, the North Star, whatever. It is a phenomenon placed in the heavens for the purpose of guiding these wise men to find the Christ child. All right, so down in verse 3, Herod is again mentioned. When Herod the king heard of this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Well, when this guy is troubled, everybody's troubled. It's like the saying, if mom's not happy, nobody's happy. So he's not happy. He is a descendant of Esau. He is an Idumean, which were the descendants of the Edomites. And of course, all these names hated the Jews. Esau, Jacob and Esau, that's where it started. And there's a hatred there between, say, the Arabs and the Jews. We're actually seeing that on TV in the news lately. So he's not happy. He's troubled to hear about this birth of Jesus. He is one who protects his throne, and he's done so in some pretty terrible ways. By the time he had died in 4 BC, or 4 AD, by the time he had died, he had murdered his wife, at least 2 of his sons, his mother-in-law, his brother-in-law, uncles, and of course the babies. We'll see that in Bethlehem later in the chapter. And he did all this to protect his throne. Let me go back to our slide for the Herods. And on this you can see over in the white side, over here, these white boxes, let's look at this one that I've got my cursor on, Mariame. That's one of them. But right below that, you see Aristobalus Executed, Alexander Executed, and Antipater Executed. And he took care of those people to protect his throne. You can even see those are children of his that he did that to. The ones in the gray apparently made the grade, made the cut, so they were not executed in that way. And we'll get into a little bit of that in a second. Okay, let's see. We've got verse 6, and I had Micah 5:2 coming up. This is another announcement of Christ coming. The Jews knew this. It's part of their Old Testament. But you, O Bethlehem, Ephrathah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be the ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from old, from ancient days. There is the roadmap to where the child would be born, and they knew that. But anyway, Herod is asking that question here in our first couple of verses. He calls in verse 4, his chief priests and scribes. He inquires of them as to where the Messiah was to be born. Verses 5 and 6, they tell him, well, in Bethlehem of Judea. And then they quote to him Micah 5:2 there in verse 6. So now he knows where it is. So verse 7, he secretly calls the Magi, and he determines from them the exact time the star appeared. So now he knows it's up there in the sky. And he says to them, go there, go to Bethlehem, search for the child, and when you found him, report to me so that I may come and worship him. Does he really want to do that? I've got sort of a cartoon up here. He's saying, let me know when you find the baby, and I will buy him a birthday cake. Well, nope, he's lying, of course. He's not going to do that. He wants to kill the child. Let's see. In verse 9, I mentioned this star, and again, it's mentioned here one more time because the Magi decide they need to go out of there and go find the child. So they're going to follow the star, which again is a natural or a supernatural phenomena put up there by a god so they could find Jesus. Again, it's not a comet, it's not a planet, it's nothing like that. In verse 11, let's see, down to verse 11, coming into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother. Coming into the house. Well, he was born in the manger, at the inn, in the barn. Now he's in a house. So we know this is some time later. These magi are not going to find an infant baby who'd just been born. They're going to find a child a little bit older. Their journey, we know that they came from, let me see if we got some list here where they might have come from. They came from, let me find it on my notes, sorry about that. I do have it here, there it is. They came from Arabia, or Ethiopia, or Persia, or India, and of course the verse we saw in the first couple verses, in fact verse 1, they came from the east. So where is the east? What's east of Israel, Persia, and so forth? Probably India, I mentioned that. Maybe even China, who knows? But these fellows were kings from their area. So they had, bringing these gifts, these are very expensive gifts that they're bringing. Sorry, my writing is so tiny I can barely read my own writing. And I may just have to wing it, who knows? All right, so here they are. They visited now. They're headed away, and they're going to go to the house where Christ is with his parents. And these gifts, by the way, are definitely gifts worthy of a king. Gold symbolized his deity. Frankincense pictured his purity. And myrrh represented his death because it was used for embalming. So there are the three phases of his life, so to speak, all wrapped up with these gifts. And they're also very expensive, and they were probably able to take the value of those gifts when they, later on in our chapter, moved to Egypt. They, of course, needed money to get to Egypt and live down there before they came back. And these gifts helped them do that, of course. Let's see, verses 12 and 13, we're going to see the dream sequence here. The Magi, in verse 12, were warned by God in a dream not to return to Herod. So they're going to leave and go the other way. And by the way, let me finish this thought, and I want to go back a slide or two. And then in verse 13, now when they had gone, the Magi had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt." So we saw in chapter 1 the dreams that were given to Joseph when he was going to divorce Mary, and the angel said, "Don't do that." That's the way God talked to them in our first couple chapters. He not only talked to Joseph and Mary, he also talked to the Magi through the dream. But regarding the gifts, let me go to the slides for the gifts. And I'm inserting a little humor in here. We've got, first of all, the Magi. And again, 3 of them are pictured. Doesn't necessarily mean there were 3 of them, but they're presenting the gifts. And it says here in my next slide, right, we picked up the gold and the myrrh, but what on earth is that? It's Frankenstein, of course, because they misunderstood. Another one, frankincense, you idiot. And they brought Frankenstein with them. And then finally, my next slide is not necessarily the 3 wise men, but the 3 very wise women. Here they are. After the 3 wise men left, the 3 wiser women arrived. Fresh diapers, casseroles for the week, and lots of formula. Okay. Let's go on. I'm now covering verses 13 to the end of the chapter, verse 23. And in these verses, we're going to see the advancement or the growth of the boy. Notice we're also seeing certain aspects of Jesus' personal history reflected in the history of Israel's national history. Let me show you an example. Here's a slide of them leaving Jerusalem and heading to Egypt. Of course, the angel is over them for protection. Hosea 11:1, and this is when they're down in Egypt. This is, again, we're going to see God's protection of his son. Again, we have a prophecy being fulfilled. That's this one here on the screen. This Hosea passage originally referred to Israel going to Egypt. Remember, they did that, and then they were being now led out of Egypt by God with the Exodus generation. And the parallel is the same here for Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. They had to go to Egypt, just as the children of Israel did, and then God leads them out of Egypt. So we see a parallel there. Verses 16 through 18 has a reference, actually, in verse 18. It quotes this Jeremiah passage. This is what the Lord says: "A voice is heard in Ramah, mourning and great weeping, Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because her children are no more." This quote is depicting the wailing at the time of Israel's exile. They went to Babylon. Herod's atrocity, which is the killing of all the babies, is viewed with this Jewish background in mind. Since Matthew was writing to the Jews, they would certainly understand this quote that you see here. Ramah, in our verse, it says, "A voice is heard in Ramah." Ramah was a town just not too far from Jerusalem. I think it's north of Jerusalem. And it was the staging area when Nebuchadnezzar rounded up all the Jews to march them off to Babylon. Ramah represented that particular aspect. And this is where all the captives were taken before they were marched off to Babylon. Rachel, who's mentioned here, she's the mother of Joseph and Benjamin. Well, she had 12 sons, and 2 of them are Joseph and Benjamin. So she's mentioned here. And she's seen as weeping over the exiles, but will be assured that they will return. And you'll see that in verses 16 and 17, but of Jeremiah, not of our passage, but of Jeremiah. And it says, as I continue on with Jeremiah 31, "Thus says the Lord, refrain thy voice from weeping, and thine eyes from tears. For thy work shall be rewarded, saith the Lord, and they shall come again from the land of the enemy. And there is hope in thine end, saith the Lord, that thy children shall come again to their own border." So the children of Israel who are in Egypt, this verse says, they will come back. And you no longer need to weep for them, because they will return. This is an assurance of that, of course. Verse 16 says, let me see how it's read here. "All the male children who were in Bethlehem." Well, all the male children are going to be killed. That's Herod's orders. How many were there? Well, Bethlehem was a smaller city. So if you do the math, somebody's already done it, take all the adults, figure out what percentage of them would have children under 2 years old and younger. And I did read a number, it was around 30. It might have been more or less. That was just a guess from that particular author I was reading. So even though that's not a huge number, this act of Herod was no less brutal. His target, of course, was the anointed one. He didn't want another king, and he knows that Christ is going to be the king of the Jews, so he wants them all killed. Let's just kill them all, and then maybe I'll catch Christ in that grouping. So that was his target. He was definitely a mean guy, so to speak. And I've got a couple pictures I want to show you about that. And his object, of course, was to protect his own throne. So here's a picture of a soldier going to execute the baby, one of the babies. Here is a graphic picture of parents protecting their children. This was really a horrible scene that was going on there. And then finally, I've got a picture of a mother hiding with her baby so that that doesn't happen to her baby. Okay, down in verse 22, it talks about Archelaus. Archelaus was one of Herod's sons, and on the death of Herod, the Romans divided his kingdom among his sons. Got to go back to our chart. And you can see the names across here in the gray boxes. These are the guys that made it. So Herod Philip, the next one is Archelaus. There he is right there. He was not a nice fellow either. And his kingdom, he took the part that belonged to Judah and Samaria. Of course, that's where Jerusalem is. And that's the part he was assigned to. Antipas, who's also in one of these boxes. Antipas, there he is. He got Galilee and Berea, and then Philip in the last box over there on the right, he got northeast Palestine. Archelaus was a bloody king, and even worse than that, in the eyes of Rome, he was ineffective. So he was removed by Caesar Augustus in about 6 AD, and he was banished from the area. And then the final verse, verse 23, says, this is Mary and Joseph and Jesus, had came and lived in a city called Nazareth. They did this after their return from Egypt. So they're now living in Nazareth, and it says he shall be called a Nazarene. Well, what's a Nazarene? I've got a couple comments on Nazarenes. This was an area of Israel where people who lived there were thought of less than other areas. In fact, we have a quote out of John chapter 1. Nazareth, can anything good come from there? That was a question that was asked. This is an odd place for actually the Messiah to live because the reputation of the Nazareth area was not that great. And so that would have been quite odd that the Messiah would go there. Probably a good hiding place, though, too, wouldn't you think? Who would want to live there, right? So these people were despised and they were hated. Even Jesus himself experienced this scorn, and we see this in Isaiah 53. He is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and we hid, as it were, our faces from him, and was despised. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. Isaiah 53:3. There's the background. I want to start reading now in chapter 2 of Matthew. So let me start at verse 1. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east, and have come to worship him." Then when Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Gathering together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them, where is the Messiah was to be born? And they said to him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for this is what has been written by the prophet. And in Bethlehem, land of Judah, are by no means least among the leaders of Judah, for out of you shall come forth a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Then Herod secretly called the Magi and determined from them the exact time the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, and he said, "Go and search carefully for the child, and when you have found him, report to me so that I may come and worship him." After hearing the king, they went their way. And the star which they had seen in the east went on before them until it came and stood over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. After coming into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell down to the ground and worshipped him. Then opening their treasures, they presented to him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned by God in a dream not to return to Herod, the Magi left for their own country by another way. Now when they had gone, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to destroy him." So Joseph got up and took the child and his mother while it was still night, and left for Egypt. He remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son." Then when Herod saw that he had been tricked by the Magi, he became very enraged, and sent and slew all the male children who were in Bethlehem and all its vicinity, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had determined from the Magi. Then what had been spoken through Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, and she refused to be comforted, because they were no more. But when Herod died, behold, the angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead." So Joseph got up, took the child and his mother, and came into the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Then after being warned by God in a dream, he left for the regions of Galilee, and he came and lived in a city called Nazareth. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophets: "He shall be called a Nazarene."
Thank you very much for the reading of the word, the second chapter of the Gospel of Matthew.